Before I start the presentation, I do need to mention this presentation contains forward-looking statements that are, of course, subject to change. So it's no secret that identity is under attack. Increasingly, bad actors are targeting credentials and entitlements across employee, partner, customer, and machine identities to gain access to sensitive systems and data. According to a recent report from Verizon, over 80% of breaches stem from identity-related attacks or the use of compromised credentials. And unfortunately, this is trending in the wrong direction. Over the last year, there was a 180% increase in breaches. In many cases, bad actors are logging in with legitimate credentials that have been compromised or stolen, which makes it very hard to defend against these types of identity-related attacks. And adding to the challenge, with a continued increase in SaaS and IaaS adoption, there's a proliferation of identities across both the application and the infrastructure layers in organizations. So just gaining visibility into all these environments, let alone into all these identities, let alone securing them, is an increasingly complex challenge that every organization is dealing with. With that, I'm going to hand it off to Jeff, who's going to talk a little bit about how we're helping our customers address this challenge with Okta's Workforce Identity Cloud.
Thanks, Scott. So this is where Okta comes in. Our mission for Okta's Workforce Identity Cloud is to free anyone to use any technology safely at work. And we feel that the best way to do this is through a unified end-to-end identity secured solution. Where does that start? It actually starts before the authentication journey even begins, where we first start to discover what's actually happening with all of the risks and by applying secure by default policies to make sure that no one can access things unnecessarily. We then move on to the actual authentication process in which we want to enforce the authentication through strong phishing resistant and biometric factors of authentication across all of these critical applications and resources. And finally, it doesn't just end after we've authenticated a user. Oftentimes, as we mentioned earlier, identities can come under attack while they're already authenticated. So we need to detect and respond to changes in those authentication sessions to make sure that we don't allow any of those accounts to be taken over post-authentication. Let's take a deep dive into each one of these sections. For discovering and determining, we know that identity can be a scalable way for businesses to achieve. But traditionally, this is done in silos. And a lot of you guys understand this as you manage the different AWS instances that you have and all of AWS various products around. We don't have a really great way to answer some of the basic questions. Who has access to what? When did they get this access? Do they still need this access? And if they don't have this access, how can they actually request it? Well, in addition to Okta features like identity security posture management, which can identify leaks in the onboarding and offboarding process with standing privileges and whatnot, we can actually also include Okta Identity Governance, which gives us a way to actually give self-service requests for all of your critical AWS applications for all of your users. It first starts with access governance policies. It gets enhanced by workflows that allow you to cross domains across all the applications that you have to manage, both your internal domains and your external SaaS vendors, as well as comprehensively enhancing the entire lifecycle management process from onboarding any type of user in your environment, an employee, a contractor, even an intern for a short period of time, and allow you to effectively onboard and offboard each one of those personas effectively. With identity governance, we feel that you get a great quick time to value. You can build these things ad hoc to enable self-service. You also can reduce your operational costs, the cost that it takes to maintain should you add a new application or increase the roles, presence, and permissions that they have. And also it allows you to scale your business with ease. As you start to grow and you experience the burdens of success, this governance policies can come with it. Moving on to another critical area, Okta Privileged Access, which means the privileged access to all of your on-prem servers and other solutions. This solution by Okta follows best practices, all of the things that you're probably used to seeing, managing your privileged accounts, vaulting your secure assignments, rotating and managing your secrets, and also facilitating access requests to critical systems. We do this with a comprehensive solution that also empowers you to also audit and see all of the activity that's happening across all of these scenarios. So with governance and privileged access in conjunction with ISPM, you get a holistic, unparalleled view of visibility into your access, all while empowering your users to request access to resources that they need. Moving on to enforcement. I think this is the real exciting part where you can see some of the innovation at Okta. We have a feature that we call Okta FastPass, which allows you to funnel authentication through a managed device or an unmanaged device if you choose, but works with NIST guidelines and also gives you access through FIPS-compliant devices. It also allows you to configure policies to make sure that the right assurance level is given at the right time. And it gives you full phishing resistance posturing for your customers. Actually, as an aside, we use this at Okta today, and I can tell you across all of my critical apps, I love this experience because I get to authenticate once. I know that my access is secure, and I get access to many of our applications. Another feature that bolsters the FastPass is device assurance. And we've really invested heavily in this area to accompany a lot of the different devices that are out there, including the Chrome browsers and Chrome OS. It also gives you advanced remediation controls and grace periods should those devices not be up to your standard. We allow your users to self-manage the care of their devices and give them an understandable, readable message on how they can remediate those concerns. To take a look at how this actually works in a practical standpoint, we have, Okta has an Okta AWS CLI that allows you to have a front end, and that's the QR code that you see on the screen, a front end to access any of your AWS CLIs, SDKs, or even APIs. This actually uses an OAuth flow called device authorization. You may recognize this from how you log into your Netflix or any one of your TV apps. You scan a QR code and you type in the credentials. What this does is it routes from that untrusted device through an actual managed or trusted device and allows you to get seamless access to those APIs. So imagine all of your AWS CLI access governed through a trusted, assured, managed device with a strong phishing-resistant factor of authentication. Gives us a really great look at how we can extend their access. And finally, post-authentication, detecting and responding. Okta has released a feature we call Identity Threat Protection, or ITP, that looks at how we can manage access to all Okta systems through a pipeline that is actually managed and detected over time. This uses a common framework that we call the Shared Signals Framework. Some of you that are integrators, I've been talking about this throughout the conference. This is a standardized way where we can give events to Okta. Okta can ingest events from different domains and actually make decisions. We have continuous assessment, so even within the auth context of the user, Okta is looking at the IP changes, looking at the network zone changes for all these users as they travel throughout the world. We can collect that data and also make adaptive actions to maybe up the level of assurance that we need if they're going into an untrusted area. Or, and another feature, we can effectively log you out if you've gotten into a situation in which we need some added protection. If we've detected maybe there's elevated permissions in one application and there's a lot of account creation happening, we can just force another authentication. So to make sure that that administrator or that privileged user is the right user that's making those changes. And finally, you get full visibility into all of this through identity threat analytics. And again, this starts to sound very, very sales pitchy, but that's not all, right? On top of all of that, you really get a fully featured identity security platform. Always on, always secure, carrier grade, with integrated orchestration and identity automation that allows you to extend your management of identities across all the domains that you support. But in order for us to get this right, we really need to focus on the integrations that we support. I'm going to bring Scott back up here to talk about how we can manage those integrations.
Thanks, Jeff. So we've been investing quite a bit in new features and functionality to realize this vision of unified identity through Okta's Workforce Identity Cloud. But there's another key element to the equation, which Jeff alluded to. That's integrations. In order to get identity right, you need to get integrations right. And this is why Okta's heavily invested in expanding both the breadth and the depth of the Okta integration network. As an example, at Octane earlier this year, we announced 125 new integrations in the OIN, Okta Integration Network. These align to the various capabilities you see on the right-hand side of this slide. Things like single sign-on, lifecycle management, entitlements management, workflow-based automation, and incident remediation, as Jeff was just talking about. We're working with vendors like Slack and like AWS to ensure that these capabilities work consistently across all the most important apps in our customers' environments. And this delivers tremendous outcomes and value to our customers, including helping to enhance security posture across the environment, helping to avoid lock-in and enable customers to have choice with regard to best-of-breed tooling for whatever the business need is, as well as helping to reduce operational burden on both IT and security teams and streamline and create efficiency across the organization. Ultimately, our goal for the OIN is to enable better interoperability and better security for all SaaS. And we have a great start. We have over 7,500 integrations in the OIN today. But our work is far from done. And it's not just our work. Modern IT operates at a shared responsibility model. That means SaaS needs to evolve as well. The bar is increasing for identity security within SaaS, and Okta's focused on enabling SaaS builders to incorporate some of these next generation identity security capabilities into their products. So there's a well-known set of capabilities that you see on the left-hand side of this slide that are considered table stakes for any SaaS ISV to be able to sell into the enterprise. Things like support for federated identity, audit logs, and customer-facing SLAs. And there are a lot of off-the-shelf solutions that ISVs can leverage to relatively easily incorporate a lot of these capabilities into their products. But given the trends that we talked about earlier, the evolving threat landscape, the increasing volume of attacks, these capabilities are no longer sufficient. SaaS needs to evolve. And more specifically, the integration between SaaS and the IDP needs to expand to support a broader set of identity security use cases, the ones that Jeff's been talking about. Lifecycle management, centralized entitlements, shared risk context, and the ability to automate responses to changes in risk. So we'll talk in a second about how Okta is enabling this to happen, but first I want to talk more about the why. So as SaaS ISVs deepen their integration with Okta, it benefits the entire ecosystem. SaaS ISVs need to grow their revenue. In order to do that, they need to meet the IT and security requirements of their most valuable customers and potential customers. Okta provides a path to doing that. We help to accelerate enterprise readiness for SaaS companies. We also help to create legitimacy by enabling SaaS ISVs to support open identity standards, as well as interoperability with the leading identity provider. And lastly, we offer multiple paths into the Okta ecosystem, including via Customer Identity Cloud, which offers pre-integrated, secure, standards-based identity building blocks for developers at ISVs. On the SaaS consumer side, customers need choice. They need flexibility to consume whatever technology is meeting the business need at hand. So they're looking for secure and reliable solutions. By adopting SaaS within the Okta integration network, they get centralized and streamlined configuration, which accelerates onboarding of new applications. They get the ability to implement consistent access policies across their environment, which uplevels their security posture. And finally, they're able to provide a frictionless sign-up and authentication flows for their end users. Now the question is, how do we enable this across the entirety of the ecosystem? How do we enable these capabilities for every best-of-breed SaaS product out there? Well, the answer is through standards. Okta, since the beginning, has been committed to embracing open identity standards and taking this approach as we evolve our product. Now, identity standards are nothing new, right? As you can see here, they've literally been around for decades. The challenge is, anyone that has looked into any of these standards or attempted to implement these standards, is that they are very difficult to navigate. They're highly complex. And in many cases, they leave a lot of room for interpretation. So Okta is focused on making identity standards easier to implement for both builders and consumers of SaaS, because we believe this is the most effective and fastest way to elevate security across the entire industry. So to that end, at Octane, we announced that we are working with the OpenID Foundation and a number of peers in the industry to develop a new standard for B2B SaaS. This is the first standard of its kind that is specifically focused on B2B SaaS. Specifically, we're participating in a working group along with several other identity providers and SaaS vendors to define an interoperability profile for secure identity in the enterprise, or IPSI, as we call it for short. Now, this is in its early stages, and this is going to be a long-term process to define this new spec. But the benefit is IPSI will provide an opinionated, clear guidance around how to implement identity standards to achieve some of the capabilities you see listed on this slide. Once IPSI is finalized, it will benefit the industry by providing a better model for shared responsibility across SaaS consumers, SaaS builders, and members of the security ecosystem. It will also reduce integration time to value for ISVs that are building integrations with IDPs. And it will accelerate customer onboarding because there will be more pre-integrated solutions available to customers. And finally, it will improve consistency, interoperability, and security across the entirety of the identity fabric. So this is something we're really excited about. If anyone's interested in learning more about IPSI or participating in the working group, you can find out more on the OpenID's website, Okta's recent blog posts, or you can reach out to Jeff or myself to learn more. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Steve, who's going to share a little bit about Slack's journey with identity security and integrating with Okta.
All right. Thank you, Scott. Hi, everyone. Steve Hamrick. I've been with Slack. Actually, I cannot believe it. It's been 5 years as of October. There's two phrases that come to mind. Number one, time flies when you're having fun. And the second one is you never work a day in your life if you love what you do. And for me, that's definitely true of my time at Slack. One of the biggest reasons that I really love it is that there's very few pieces of enterprise software that you can be hopping onto a plane somewhere, turn to your right, and see somebody using it in that moment on the plane. It's not true for a lot of the enterprise companies that I worked for before. Actually, I'm curious, how many people in the room are Slack customers, Slack users today? Oh, wow. Pretty much, I've seen most everybody. I'm curious, of the folks that are Slack users, do you know that Slack's actually an acronym? Does anybody actually know what the acronym is for? I see no hands raised. This is always one of my favorite trivia facts to share. So Slack's actually an acronym for Searchable Log of All Communications and Knowledge. You'll also see it sometimes written as All Conversations and Knowledge. It's a true fact. You can look it up. It's on Wikipedia. But the reality is, from a mission perspective, when Slack started 10 years ago, actually, our original mission wasn't to be the world's best collaboration solution. Our mission was, how do we make work simpler, more pleasant, and more productive? And what we saw as the biggest opportunity was, how do we unify communications between departments? How do we reduce the swivel chairing back and forth between different applications? How do we effectively provide a single interface for people to get their work done every day? So you can imagine the priority then of making sure that what we're delivering from a Slack perspective is as secure and compliant as it can be. And in fact, that was the reason I was brought into Slack in the first place. I had a long experience in history working at companies like SAP and Oracle, bringing collaboration to the Fortune 100. And a lot of what my team and I were tasked to do was, how do we build out the enterprise scalability from a security and compliance perspective? And one of the first places we started was looking at, how do we leverage a solution like Okta as the front door experience for employees? If you're a smaller SaaS vendor and you've got maybe 50 users, it's easy to manage those user IDs and those passwords. But when you're talking about the scale of enterprise customers that we were seeing at the time, there was really no realistic way that Slack could be or should be solely responsible for managing that identity lifecycle. I want to say the first way we actually did this was not great. And this is a bit of advice. I saw some hands raised earlier, people saying that they were SaaS builders and people in the IT department leveraging solutions for building out identity management. I will say we learned a lesson. Initially, we did SAML, just-in-time provisioning. And the reality we learned was that does not work well for a collaboration solution. It's kind of like throwing a party and nobody has gotten there yet. One of the things we learned was, okay, now we've got a great way to get users signed into Slack and manage their lifecycle and session, but their identity as a user doesn't exist until they log in for the first time. What that means is I can't invite them to a channel, I can't get them into the right conversations. If I need to assign work to them or mention them for some reason, I've got no way of doing that. So that's why we expanded the scope. So after we did initially SAML, just-in-time or JIT provisioning, we moved right over to the SCIM standard. Now, the SCIM standard was wonderful because it allowed us to bring in that rich profile information. A lot of that profile information now shows up on your profile in Slack. So if you've ever noticed, if you open that right-hand panel, you're going to see a lot of really important workforce information, things like your location, your manager, your org chart, and so on. All that information typically is derived from a workforce management solution. So typically what we see is customers have a HRIS, something like a Workday or SuccessFactors attached to an identity solution like Okta. That information gets passed from Okta into Slack. Now the other advantage of that is that we're able to gather information about what roles you should occupy. And that was the next thing that we focused on after we nailed the front door experience, realizing, again, JIT wasn't the right way to do it, SCIM is the right way to do it. The next focus for us was how do we bring users into the right roles, into the right channels? Because especially if you're talking about a larger organization, your day one experience cannot be, oh my gosh, I got to pop in and ask a bunch of people to add me to a lot of different channels. Ideally, from day one, you're getting invited to the right conversations, the right parts of Slack from the beginning. And we're making sure that you have the right user groups, assigning you the right privileges. In fact, one of the things that we just invested in over the course of the last year was a roles framework for the Enterprise Grid product. So if you're familiar with Enterprise Grid, that is our top tier enterprise offering. One of the interesting things about Enterprise Grid, by the way, is that it requires SSO. It requires a partner like Okta because we recognize the importance not only from a user experience perspective, but also the advantages it brings in terms of security. So again, we made sure that users get provisioned to the right groups, to the right channels. Then we realized, okay, there's not just one central IDP. A lot of organizations often have more than one. So another thing we expanded to was not just looking at how we provision employee access, but how do we also provision users who are contractors, interns, co-ops, part-time, that might be vendors or partners. They may have an entirely different Okta instance for those users. It might even be a different vendor entirely. So the next thing we did was expand to support multiple identity providers at the same time, being able to not only provision those users by SCIM, but sign them in and make sure that we're able to set them up with the right roles in the right channels from the beginning. After we did all that work, now we've got all these users in Slack, the big question becomes, how do we make sure that we're being responsible in protecting that user identity? Scott mentioned this earlier at the beginning of the presentation. I couldn't agree more. A lot of the quote-unquote bad actors we're seeing are not necessarily exclusively outside of the organization. And in some cases, they have actually been attacking that front door. They have been looking for ways to phish credentialed access from not just the individual SaaS app, but from the IDP itself. So we saw an opportunity to provide what we call shared, but actually, I should say Okta calls shared signals. How do we send information from a behavioral perspective, not just about the status of the session? So is the session being utilized from the right geographic locations? Is it using the original client that started the session in the first place? But is the user doing things that they probably shouldn't be? Like, are they uploading too much content? Are they downloading too much content? Are they searching for things in Slack that maybe they shouldn't? That information we now make available to solutions like Okta, but we see it again as a shared responsibility. A lot of our customers also ingest this into a security information events monitoring solution like a Datadog or a Splunk, and they're able to then monitor these signals that we're sending them in real time and make decisions about when and where to lock the identity. Most commonly what we see is customers actually lock the identity at the SSO provider level. Not only will they kick the session off of Slack, but they'll lock that session, that user at the IDP level. So the next phase after that was, okay, we've got front door, we've got the users going to the right channels. How do we make sure that we support a sign-out process to make sure that if a session starts behaving unusually, that we're able to kick it from Slack as quickly as possible? That comes in two different forms. So one is we want to make sure that from a management perspective, an admin can go into the admin panel, find that user, kick that user off of either mobile or desktop or both. But because we're now able to send a lot more information about individual sessions, we can actually allow customers to automate the management of those user sessions directly from an API in Slack. So now with this API in Slack, you can actually send a logout signal for a specific session, not just for the user across a set of devices, but for a specific session. We also found this really beneficial for customers that were using shared device scenarios, right? I might have a contractor who works in a warehouse. They're logging into Slack at the beginning of their shift. Once their shift is over, I want to get them out of Slack as quickly as possible. and or maybe they lost the device, right? Maybe they were using a shared device, they've lost it. I want to just sign them out of that one device, and now I can do that with the sign out. I think Scott mentioned this, and I want to emphasize that the one thing that we definitely learned from the partnership with Okta was that it is mutually beneficial for us to focus on shared standards and look at open standards as a way to integrate. The standards that we worked on with Okta definitely allowed us to make choice for customers, although I will say the overwhelming choice that customers make is to partner with Okta as a front door for Slack. But I think the benefit from a customer perspective has been immense, right? Improves that login experience. It reduces the risk of those passwords and accounts being lost by employees. Consolidates their identity management into a known set of IDPs. Reduces the risk of that data breach or session theft I mentioned earlier. And then reduces the risk of having Slack access after the time of your employment. This is another thing that was really important, that onboarding and offboarding of not only employees and contractors makes sure that folks that are not supposed to still have access to Slack do not still have it. And that's why typically it's tied to that upstream workforce management solution. So I want to thank Okta for the time to share this story with you all, and also for the partnership. I think it's been incredibly beneficial for our customers.
Great. So, thanks, Steve. That's all we have in terms of slides. At this point, I've got a few prepared questions that I'm going to speak to Steve about. And then we will open it up to the audience to ask any questions that might be on your mind, whether it's for Okta or for Slack. So, Steve, you talked a little bit about some early learnings in the identity space.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on that and share a little more around the backstory of what led Slack to first start thinking about an integration with Okta?
So the reality is we started signing our first really big enterprise customers. And when they came to us, the solution we had been relying on up to this point of just using username and password management directly out of Slack, when you're a smaller 50 to 100 person tenant, that's fine. But the second you're talking about tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of users, the challenges really go up. And the tens of thousands, that's when we learned a lot about SAML JIT and what works and what doesn't work. The hundreds of thousands is when we really started focusing on that SCIM integration.
Yeah, makes sense. We talked a little bit about this concept of a shared responsibility model,
yes.
Right? The idea that there's a shared responsibility between IT and security teams, SaaS vendors, and the security ecosystem. As a product leader, how do you think about the shared responsibility model?
I think it's definitely a shared risk, shared reward. I think from our point of view, the more that we're participating and cooperating and sharing what we see as behavioral information happening within Slack, the more we're actually protecting a customer as a whole. And not just thinking about it exclusively from the island of content that exists within Slack, but thinking about what is at risk from an entire identity. That user may have access to other systems, for example, and they may be doing things in Slack that is a key warning sign that is, there's problems that the employer may need to look into.
Couldn't agree more. At Okta, we think about identity security every day. Can you share a little bit about what identity security means to you?
Identity security, to me, I think sometimes people think exclusively about the username and passwords around the user, but it's so much more than that. It's what is this user supposed to be able to do? What should they have access to? What should they not have access to? I think this is one of the things that typically happens in larger enterprises is that the potential for over-permissioning of something is huge. And so being able to think about identity protection as not just how do I literally keep track of the usernames and passwords, but how do I make sure that that person is doing the things I expect them to do and has access to the things I expect them to have access to and has the right roles in the organization is critical to actually protecting what's at stake, which is really the company's intellectual property.
Yeah. And it's clear that Slack takes identity security seriously, as shown through the various integrations you've built with Okta. Can you talk a little bit about maybe a specific use case or outcome that you've been able to unlock for a customer through the integrations you built with Okta?
So one of the things that we got asked to do about 3 years ago was really focus on how do we supply access to people who are primarily in the front lines. So they are store associates, they're people that are sitting on a shared desktop or machine. They have a limited window of time that they're supposed to be using Slack. And initially, we did not have a great way of handling all of the myriad of concerns that comes along with that, right? Including things like the session duration, how long you're allowed to use, the geofencing, for example. You're only allowed to use this Slack app within these devices from these locations at these times. All of these were things that, in partnership with Okta, we were able to unlock, and we were able to support a whole class of employee, not just necessarily in one industry, but the class of employee across a wide range of industries, right? Because we see frontline workers in healthcare, in retail, in manufacturing, and even in the service industry, telecommunications. There's a lot of customers that use Slack every day on those devices, and without this set of capabilities, we would have never been able to deploy it.
Makes sense. So earlier I saw we have several application builders in the audience, some focused on internal apps, some working for an ISV. What advice would you give to an application builder, an engineer or a product manager who may be considering trade-offs between adding identity security capabilities or integrations to their app versus that next value-add feature?
Well, I think kind of building off the prior question, definitely thinking about it from what are the potentials for me to address entire sets of customers I wasn't able to address before, and thinking about it as a way to expand into different industries and different use cases. Again, that was a large reason I was brought on board, was that Slack wanted to expand into regulated industries, healthcare, public sector, financial services, and we had to meet a lot of their expectations and exceed those in order to have them deploy Slack at all. But I also think of it as it shouldn't be a trade-off or a choice. Like, it shouldn't be security or next new wave of features. You have to think about what's the risk of even a single breach in terms of the trust that you have from your customers. So if you're not thinking about it from day one, how do you make sure that every step of the way you're providing the best and most secure environment for your customers? That can just all topple overnight. Like, if you think about, without naming company examples, there have been examples of companies just in the recent history who did a very poor job of cybersecurity, and they went from being worth hundreds of millions, if not billions, to practically zero overnight. And the more valuable the information that you're protecting, the more valuable the service you're offering, the higher the need for security will be. So I think thinking of it not so much as a trade-off, but it's an enabler for revenue from day one is crucial.
Yeah, so it sounds like in terms of ROI, you think about it in terms of unlocking new markets or new portions of markets,
Absolutely.
As well as downside avoidance or risk management.
Exactly.
We also have many IT and security professionals in the audience. What advice would you give to them in terms of questions they should be asking of their SaaS vendors as it relates to identity security?
Are they doing enough to partner with the tools and the products that I use every day? And I think that that's one thing I can commend Okta on from a partnership perspective. I think the perspective about IPSI in particular, and the push for seeing that there's this shared risk, shared reward, shared benefit is really important. So I think thinking about, is my vendor trying to narrow me down to a very known set of applications that they tend to manage and control really well, and then everything else sort of gets a backseat to that? Or am I working with a vendor and a partner that I can trust has my best interests in mind and is looking to then support what is going to be inevitably a heterogeneous environment? I think very few customers are wall-to-wall locked in with one vendor, or they would prefer not to be. Yeah. And so thinking about how is this vendor that I'm working with actually achieving that goal of being really supportive of my heterogeneous environment.
Yeah. And as we all know, security is a moving target, right? So I'm sure your customer needs are continuing to evolve over time. Just from a practical standpoint, how do you stay on top of that and make sure you're meeting their needs, not just today, but in the future?
Well, that's where events like this are actually really beneficial. I think one of the things that we've learned is partnering with customers is very valuable. Getting insight from them, working with chief information security officers, working with folks in the IT and identity management space gives you a much better perspective of what are the current set of risks and threats. It's where we learn most of what we actually fold into the roadmap for Slack. So it's, I think, crucial to stay on that social network and stay connected with your colleagues in the space.
And to that point, any sort of predictions or observations around how you see identity security evolving in the collaboration space?
There is one term that I've heard over and over again, and I like propagating it because I think it's very valid, which is our organization may have been relying on security through obscurity. I talked about it earlier, right? I may have been relying on the fact that maybe we weren't governing all the content we really should have, but thankfully it was hard to find in the organization. And now I think with artificial intelligence and knowledge synthesis becoming a key operative mode for people to discover and process content in the organization, the more that you can think about how well governed are my roles and the access to information. Am I using an identity provider that's taking some of that workforce information, applying it to the kinds of roles that people are getting, and that's being cascaded down to my SaaS apps is going to be crucial. The more we start throwing these AI use cases, because I think this is definitely an unstoppable force right now in the industry, the more we start throwing those use cases, those technologies on top of that data set, the more important it will be to make sure that that data set is only including the stuff that I really should have access to and nothing more.
My last question for you. Anything exciting in the roadmap or recently announced at Slack that you'd like to share?
If you haven't seen it yet, I think take a look at Agentforce integration with Slack. There's our booths here. You can actually interact with employee agents from the Agentforce platform for Slack. Speaking of AI, I think what we've done so far is tremendous. It makes perfect sense that Slack is a multiplayer experience, that's where your agents should live. It's also one of the most, speaking of vendors that support heterogeneity, we tend to be the most open and agnostic platform we can be for bringing in all the apps and data that you use every day. So I think that makes those employee agents even more powerful.
All right. Well, thank you again, everyone, for joining. Really appreciate it. And feel free to reach out to any of us afterwards. We'll be around.
You can stop by booth 344 in the Venetian if you want to see the Okta booth and connect with us. Definitely. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks all.